Heraclius is one of the strongest commanders in Rise of Kingdoms when it comes to garrisons. Between his versatility in troops, his ability to keep a shield up to keep himself alive, and the fact that he pairs well with basically every meta garrison commander for every main troop type, he basically has a niche everywhere. While I was initially hesitant that he wouldn't be better than YSS, I have never been happier to be wrong. So in today's video, we're going to be going over his skills, his talents, where you're going to want to put him in terms of formation and equipment, and what kind of commanders you're going to want to pair him with to maximize his kit. Without further ado, let's get started. First, let's tackle his skills. His primary skill is a 5-target AoE with 1200 damage factor that of course reduces by 15% for each additional target. We covered in my AoE damage reduction video that basically the more targets you get past, I believe it was 3, it really does less damage overall. But you're still applying good damage factor, and the exception, because you are a garrison, is 4 of these targets are probably field marches. And at most, at least three of them are typically going to be field marches, which means that 1200 damage factor, even when it's reduced by 40%, 45%, is going to be doing a lot of damage. In addition, you do get a shield for 5 seconds, which is a damage factor 1200. This is actually a very strong shield. I underestimated this in my first assessment. That was part of why I was so hesitant on it. His second skill is a 30% health increase, not for any specific troop type, which is what makes him so good. 30% health is insanely useful, and the fact that you don't have to stick it to a specific troop type means it's going to be good for everyone. In addition, his normal attacks have a 30% chance to increase his own counterattack damage by 30% for 3 seconds. We're going to be glazing over the city side of this because we're going to be covering him in an objective manner, but the 40% boost is just a little bit higher, and then once every 8 seconds. The 30% chance is a lot more significant than I had originally anticipated as well. It is pretty much triggering really often, especially in a swarm heavy meta. It helps him stay afloat very well. The third skill is a 20% skill damage boost, which is great because pretty much every commander in Rise of Kingdoms, with the exception of Zenobia, that is a garrison, is pretty much a skill damage based one in the current Season of Conquest meta. When they use a skill, they get another small shield, which is slightly higher if it's garrisoned, and this basically is going to help you keep alive too. It can absorb a couple of white damage chips, or it can absorb part of a skill from an enemy rally. Of course, it is limited to once every 8 seconds, but you're pretty much going to be having this when you get swarmed going up all the time, especially because your active skill is going to be going more often because you're getting more rage from being swarmed. The fourth skill is a 15% defense bonus, 15% attack bonus, which is okay. And if your troops attack while it has a shield, it'll deal direct damage of damage factor 1000. This was something that I really had underestimated as well. This is a lot of damage, and it hits very hard, especially for the fact that it is really such a weak passive stat skill. This 1000 damage factor ping, when you have 2 different skills that give you shields, is really going to trigger pretty often, and you should be able to keep it going. So really, this is a great way to resist swarm. This is a great way to resist rallies that are sustained damage you out, and it does well in both in a very generalist kind of way. So while it might not be as effective 1v1 as certain commanders, or it might not be as effective against swarm as certain commanders, it does both in a very strong way. Lastly, his expertise gives 10% less damage from normal attacks, and then it goes an additional 20, so to 30% normal attack damage reduction if you have 3 different unit types. This is typically done in a garrison by your main troop being 80 and your 2 off troops being 10% and 10%. But you could even run 70, 15, 15 to ensure you keep this, because this 30% normal attack damage reduction is huge for resisting swarm, and it is huge for countering the likes of Attila, the likes of anybody who does a significant amount of white damage on their passive attacks. And on top of the fact that the less normal attack damage you take, the more troops you have to counter skill and to counter attack. So even if a troop doesn't deal a lot of white damage from their passive normal attacks, you're going to be able to have more to hit them back with because you're taking less normal attack damage. So it does impact a lot more than it looks at a glance. Next, we're going to go over talents. I'm going to go over this very briefly because typically you're not going to have Hera as a primary because you're going to want to have the talent tree of your primary troop type in your mixed garrison. For example, if you're using cavalry, you're going to want to have Jan or Jadwig's talents because their talents are more applied to cavalry, where you get 80% of the total effectiveness at a much higher rate than these leadership talents. But overall, this is the talent tree I would use in this case. It is essentially Theodora's. Kingsguard is pretty useful. The big thing is having these 3 garrison talents, just like every other garrison commander. Some other usefulness is, a percent defense is gonna be a pretty good jump because it's all percentage. You're gonna have rage here when attacked, reducing damage taken here, increasing counterattack damage here, and then reducing skill damage taken there. So you do get some good defensive bonuses, but you don't really get a lot of raw stats like you would from the cav tree or the infantry tree or any sort of other main primary commander garrison tree, which is why Hera, much like YSS, is often a secondary commander. Next, for formations, I very much still prefer Wedge. It's hard to go wrong with Wedge because the skill damage is so useful. And whatever you use as a primary is going to be able to use Wedge very well as well, so you're not hurting anybody there that way. If you want to have a little bit more swarm resist, you could always go Arch, but I don't necessarily go for that unless there's a very specific circumstance, like I have great inscriptions that help resist swarm or reduce damage taken or increase damage dealt on an Arch formation armament. But it's just kind of a great option if you don't have any other options. So it makes it a less great option. Hollow Square is honestly a good secondary option to Wedge because you can have the shield reduced damage taken is pretty nice, but it's mostly if you have the specialty inscriptions, because the specialty inscriptions on Hollow Square give a lot of shield boosts and a lot of bonuses just like Hera does based on your shields. So if you have a good Hollow Square armament or a good set of armaments with the specialty inscriptions on them, you can definitely consider using this for Hera. But otherwise, I think you should probably stick with Wedge formation, or if you don't have enough Wedge formation armaments and you have good inscriptions on Arch, you could also run Arch. So now that we've talked about the skills, the talents, and the overall formation ideas, let's talk about the equipment. Much like your primary commander, you're going to be tailoring Heraclius' equipment to whatever your primary troop type is going to be. So, for example, if you're using cavalry, you're going to want to use as much cavalry equipment as possible, and you're going to want to try to focus on at least 2 out of 6 on the set bonus. If you can get to 4 out of 6, that is great. But if you want to instead go for the 2 Season of Conquest items like I'm doing here, you could definitely do that as well and get some good stats. Both sets are going to be great against Swarm because you're going to get the damage or the overall counterattack damage. And it's just going to be down to what your personal preference is. For many, it's going to make more sense to just go for the 4 out of 6 and call it good. For infantry, I recommend minimum 2 out of 6. You don't necessarily need the march speed. But if you're planning on using this set of equipment for the field and the garrisons, you might want to look into going for 4 out of 6 because the stat trade-off isn't that crazy to go up there, especially if you're skipping Season of Conquest items. And the 10% march speed is super useful for field marches. And it is somewhat useful if you've got to walk a long way, but as a garrison you should probably be up on the front line. Lastly, for archers, you can go 4 out of 6 minimum on the set pieces, but you can also go all the way up to the full 6 if you don't want to build the Season of Conquest items and get along just fine with that extra health, because that is huge for resisting Swarm as well and gives you good stats, which are actually probably right on par with the Season of Conquest items. So it's all going to come down to your personal preference. But like I said, overall, the final decision is going to be based on what your personal needs are and what your main troop type is. So if your main troop type is Cavs, you're going to have to fit the Cav garrison of the primary you're going to use. For example, Jan or Jadwiga. Now that we've talked about, well, basically everything but pairings, let's get to the nitty-gritty and talk about pairings. The first, and by far most common you'll probably see, is Jan Hera. Jan Hera right now is probably the strongest garrison in the game. Whether you are defending a flag, your city, a fort, a pass, pretty much every situation, Jan Hera is the top or at near the top when it comes to defending a point or your building. Jan does so well resisting Swarm on his own, and you throw Hera on there with a skill damage boost, a health boost. It basically is hard to beat, even 2 versus 1 with a double rally. It is hard to lose that trade as a Jan Hera. And there's plenty of times this KvK where we had double rallies, and the garrison still won the trade, and still won the point and defended. So overall, this is an insanely solid option. Dido is the archer option, and she is definitely very solid, but not nearly as strong as Jan is. When it comes to the overall skills, she does still have some good defense and good ability. However, Dido's normal attack damage reduction is completely dependent on being only archers, whereas Hera's needs to have 3 troop types. So you can only have one or the other. If you have one troop type with Hera, you get 20% normal attack damage reduction total. Whereas if you have mixed troops with Dido, you lose the 10% here. But if you have Hera, you gain 30% normal attack damage reduction. So you sacrifice Dido's ability to give normal attack damage reduction to gain Hera's. So it's not nearly as big a jump as we first thought on release. But it is definitely a solid option, and it is better than any other archer alternative right now. So it's a great option to hold it if you have archers available. But I still don't recommend it in super intense situations. It doesn't stand up nearly as well to a double rally as Jan does. And it doesn't stand up to Swarm as well, even with Hera having the good Swarm resistance. Lastly, for infantry, Flavius is the option. I always like having Flavius with Hold the Line. Of course, you can't do that with Hera, but that is okay, because the normal attack damage reduction that Hera gives you is super useful, and Flavius has a good set of skills already as it is. So this is a great option, and actually 2057's Crowny here actually loves using this pairing. So it is definitely a very solid pairing and holds well. And the only thing that really worries me in this situation is that infantry is the next set of commanders coming out next. Is if we get a new garrison, is it going to unseat Flavius? So that is the only hesitation I have when it comes to building Flavius and Hera if you don't already have Flavius. Some alternative options if you are just getting back into garrisons. Zenobia does pair decently with Hera, but the skill damage that Hera has obviously doesn't do a lot for Zenobia since her primary damage is white damage. But it does help her resist Swarm much like YSS does, and it'll perform better than Xeno YSS. Alternatively, if you have Jadwiga, that is also an option for you. She does increase damage, and then you have Hera that increases damage and reduces normal attack damage. It makes her tankier, but she still doesn't trade quite as well as Jan does. So you'll see her play second to Jan a lot more often when it comes to pairing priority. And if you were building brand new, Jan is definitely the better decision. But if you don't have Jan yet, you have Hera, and you're looking for an option, Jadwiga Hera will actually trade pretty solidly until you can get Jan ready. But with that, we'll wrap up our discussion on Hera. I think he's really good, and like I said, I have never been more happy to be wrong from my initial thoughts on him. But let me know what you think. Do you see yourself using him? Do you think he's the best garrison in the game right now? Let me know in the comments. If you want to see another commander covered as well, let me know down there, because oftentimes those comments become future video topics. And as always, good luck, fight well, and I will see you on the battlefield.